There is a piece of land on this earth that every single human being alive today is connected to. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, biologically, genetically, whether you are Igbo or Irish, Zulu or Japanese, whether your family has lived in Lagos for 1,000 years or moved to London last year, if you trace your ancestry back far enough, every single line converges on the same place. And it is not Egypt. It is not even a country that exists today. It's a crack in the earth in East Africa, 6,000 kilometers long, and for over 3 million years, it has been quietly keeping a record that scientists are still piecing together, a record that answers one of the oldest questions a human being can ask. Where did we actually come from? Tonight, I want to take you somewhere most history videos never go. Past the kingdoms, past the pharaohs, past every empire and border you've ever learned about. Because before any of that could exist, something else had to happen first, something stranger, older, and far more astonishing than most people realize. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some of the world's leading scientists now believe the story of humanity's origin isn't what we were taught, and why the oldest human DNA on Earth still lives, quietly, in a small population most people have never heard of. To understand how Africans came into existence, you first have to understand a much older question. How did humans come into existence at all? And nearly every road that answers that question runs through East Africa. Roughly 7 million years ago, in the forests and grasslands of what is now Chad, Kenya, and Ethiopia, a creature began to change. Its spine straightened, its hips shifted. It began to stand and then, slowly, to walk on 2 legs. Scientists call this family of early upright walkers hominins, and their fossils read like chapters in an unfinished book, Sahelanthropus, Ardipithecus. Then the famous Australopithecus, the family that gave us Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia's Afar region, a small woman who walked this earth some 3.2 million years ago. Why here? Why did this transformation happen in this particular stretch of Africa and nowhere else on the planet? The land itself gives us a clue. The Rift Valley was splitting the continent apart, throwing up mountains, drying out ancient forests, and turning dense jungle into open savanna. Trees became scarce. The creatures who could no longer swing from branch to branch had to learn to move differently across open ground. Standing tall let them see over the grass spot predators, spot food. Spot each other from a distance. Walking on 2 legs freed the hands. And freed hands over millions of years learned to do something no other creature's hands had done before. They learned to make tools. By about 2.6 million years ago, in what's now Ethiopia, a hominin species began deliberately striking stone against stone to create sharp edges, the first tools in the story of humanity. Then came Homo habilis, handy man. Then Homo erectus, who mastered fire, who built the first hunting bands, who was the first of our ancestors to walk out of Africa entirely and into Asia and parts of Europe long before we existed as a species. But Erectus was not us. Not yet. The valley was not finished. For nearly 2 million years, the human family tree kept branching, kept testing itself, kept dying out in some lines and surviving in others, always here, always in Africa, refining itself against this unforgiving, generous land. And then, somewhere between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. A new kind of hominin emerged, one with a rounder skull, a smaller face, a brain organized in ways that would allow for something the world had never seen. Complex language, abstract thought, the ability to imagine a future that didn't yet exist and plan for it. This was Homo sapiens. Us, for decades, scientists believed the story began in East Africa alone, around the Homo River in southern Ethiopia, where skulls dating back roughly 195,000 years were unearthed among the oldest anatomically modern human remains ever found. But in 2017, a discovery in Morocco rewrote the timeline. at a site called Jebel Irhoud. Researchers uncovered the remains of Homo sapiens dating back approximately 300,000 years, pushing the origin of our species back further than anyone had confirmed before. And revealing something even more important, it showed that early humans weren't confined to one single corner of the continent. The old idea of a single Garden of Eden, one valley, one population, one birthplace has given way to something richer and more African in spirit. Researchers now believe Homo sapiens emerged not from one isolated population, but from multiple interconnected groups spread across the continent in the north, in the east, in the south, who moved, mixed, separated, and mixed again over hundreds of thousands of years. Africa itself, in its full breadth, was the birthplace. Not a single garden, but an entire continent breathing life into one species, slowly, patiently, over hundreds of millennia. Genetics backs this up in extraordinary ways. When scientists study human DNA today, they find that the oldest, most diverse genetic lineages on Earth belong to certain populations still living in Africa, particularly the San and Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, whose ancestors' genetic lines split off from the rest of humanity's family tree over 200,000 years ago and remained remarkably distinct ever since. This means that in a very real scientific sense, the deepest roots of every human being alive today, whether in Lagos or London, Beijing or Bogota, trace back to African ancestors. And some of the oldest living branches of that root system are still here, still African, still walking this land. We were not born once and finished. We were born slowly, in scattered fires across a vast continent, by people who had no idea they were making history. They were only trying to survive the next season, find the next water source, keep their children alive through the next dry year. That is how you came into existence, not with a single miracle, with 100,000 years of small human miracles repeated. Becoming anatomically human was only half the story. The other half, the harder half, was becoming behaviorally human. Walking upright and having a modern skull does not automatically make a people who paint, who bury their dead with care, who tell stories, who believe in something beyond themselves. That transformation, too, happened here. At Blombos Cave on South Africa's southern coast, archaeologists found engraved pieces of ochre dating back over 70,000 years, deliberate, geometric cross-hatch patterns, carved by hand, for no survival purpose at all. This wasn't a tool. This was art. This was a mind capable of symbol, of meaning, of decoration for its own sake. At the same site, researchers found shell beads pierced and strung together, the oldest known jewelry on Earth. Someone, more than 70,000 years ago, wanted to look beautiful. Someone else, perhaps, wanted to see them as beautiful. Around the same period and slightly after, evidence across the continent shows humans crafting bone harpoons for fishing, grinding pigments for body paint, developing regional tool traditions distinct enough that archaeologists can tell one community's technological signature from another's, meaning these were not scattered bands doing the same thing by accident. These were cultures. Different groups of early Africans in different regions, already developing their own ways of doing things, their own aesthetic choices, their own identities. This is the quiet, staggering truth at the heart of this story. Everything that makes us recognizably human: art, ornament, ritual, technique, cultural identity was already alive on this continent tens of thousands of years before a single human foot ever left it. Africa did not just produce the human body. It produced the human mind as we know it, tested and refined over unimaginable stretches of time, long before anyone called it a cradle of civilization. For most of human history, Africa was not one people. It was and still is the most genetically, linguistically, and culturally diverse continent on the planet. More distinct language families exist in Africa than on any other continent, And that diversity is a fossil record of its own, showing us how humans spread, settled, separated, and formed distinct nations over tens of thousands of years. One of the most important chapters in this internal spreading is what researchers call the Bantu expansion. Beginning roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, communities speaking early Bantu languages began migrating outward from a homeland near the border of what is now Nigeria and Cameroon. Over the next several thousand years, in wave after wave, these communities moved south and east, carrying with them ironworking, agriculture, and new farming techniques that could support far larger populations than hunting and gathering alone. This expansion reshaped the entire southern half of the continent. Today, more than 300 million people across sub-Saharan Africa speak a Bantu language from Swahili on the East African coast to Zulu and Xhosa in the south. Entire nations, entire identities trace their linguistic roots back to this slow multi-thousand-year unfolding. But the Bantu expansion is only one thread. In the Sahara, which was not always desert, but for thousands of years a green, lake-filled savanna teeming with cattle herders, fishers, and farmers, early communities thrived until the climate shifted and the land dried, pushing populations toward the Nile Valley and the West African coast. In the Horn of Africa, distinct populations developed with their own deep genetic and linguistic histories. In the forests of Central Africa, communities who would come to be known by outsiders as pygmy peoples, the Mbuti, the Baka, the AKA, developed some of the oldest continuous ways of life on Earth. Genetically distinct lineages stretching back tens of thousands of years. Every one of these movements, splits, and settlements is a piece of the answer to how Africans came into existence, because Africans, plural, did not come into existence once. They came into existence again and again, in valleys and forests and coastlines and deserts, each community shaped by its particular stretch of land, its particular climate, its particular struggles and abundances. The Zulu did not become the Zulu the same way the Yoruba became the Yoruba, or the Amhara became the Amhara, or the Maasai became the Maasai. Each is its own long, specific story of survival, adaptation, and identity, all of them branches of that same first root that began in the Rift Valley hundreds of thousands of years earlier. Somewhere between 70 and 60,000 years ago, long after Homo sapiens had already been fully human, fully creative, fully us for well over 100,000 years, a portion of the population began to leave. They crossed narrow straits at the mouth of the Red Sea, moved along the coastlines of Arabia, and pressed onward into Asia, into Europe, into Australia, and eventually tens of thousands of years later into the Americas. This is the migration often called out of Africa, and it is the reason every non-African population on Earth today descends from a relatively small group of people who left this continent. But here is what often gets lost in that story. Those who left were the minority. The vast, overwhelming majority of the human story and the vast majority of human genetic diversity stayed exactly where it began. The people who remained continued the work that had already been underway for hundreds of thousands of years, building, adapting, separating into new nations, developing new languages, new technologies, new spiritual systems, new art. While the travelers were still learning to survive unfamiliar climates in Europe and Asia, Africa was already deep into its own long, rich unfolding. This is why, genetically, Africa remains the most diverse continent on Earth, more diverse than all of Europe, Asia, and the Americas combined, despite those regions holding the majority of the world's population today. The genetic variation that exists across African peoples today, from the tall, lean, Nilotic-speaking communities of the Sudanese and South Sudanese highlands, to the San of the Kalahari, to the West African communities whose descendants would one day be scattered across the Americas, by force represents the deepest, oldest branches of the entire human family tree. Every human being outside Africa is, genetically speaking, descended from a relatively narrow slice of that tree. Every African population, by contrast, carries within it echoes of nearly the whole tree's roots. So when you ask how Africans came into existence, the honest answer is this: slowly, patiently, and first.